thank you for tuning in. This is G.A. Donovan speaking to you from Asia Society headquarters in New York. The three experts on our panel today all have many years' experience in the field as first-hand observers of China's changing religious landscape. We're delighted to have with us Professor Mayfair Yang from the University of California, Santa Barbara, Professor Gareth Fisher from Syracuse University, and Professor John Osburg from the University of Rochester. John is one of our fellows here at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. Now, for those of you watching live, we invite you to submit questions for our panel. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to do that, and we'll get to those later in the session. Now, I want to begin with an apologia of sorts. Back in March, Huang Yanzhong wrote an article in the New York Times titled, "America is Dangerously Ignorant of What's Going On in China." Yanzhong argued that the main reason was that China had become more closed off to the outside world. There are now fewer opportunities for foreign scholars to conduct fieldwork and meet with Chinese officials and other contacts. Ian Johnson made a similar observation a few months earlier, writing in the New York Review of Books. "We are bombarded with policy analysis," Ian wrote, "but these are impossible to formulate intelligently without understanding the country's deeper trends." Ian then reflected on how the outside world thinks about China and concluded that people seem uninterested in exploring it. Now, this is a shame. So our aim today is to explore some of the deeper trends that can help us understand what's going on in China. Now, with that, I'd like to pose my first question to Professor Yang. Professor Yang spent many years studying the revival of popular religion in rural Zhejiang province. So to start us off, can you tell us a bit about your research and what you see as the main factors that inspired this religious revival?
Okay, so I've been doing field work in rural and small town Wenzhou on the southeastern coast of China in Zhejiang province. And so the way that I see it, these people the local people they have a very entrepreneurial culture, and they take risks, and they're into private economy in the sense of family as the basic unit of entrepreneurial activity. But privatization does not mean that they don't have a lot of public spiritedness. They, organize themselves into lineages by kinship ties. And also, they have a lot of communal spirit, village levels and all kinds of So they're very spontaneously self-organizing kind of culture. And that was suppressed during the Maoist era. But as the local saying goes, even before Mao was dead and buried, they started re-privatizing the economy, breaking up into private plots, and also going into business, family businesses. And so in that period of renewal in the 80s, they started out with traditional rotating credit societies, where they needed money to invest in their businesses, and they would get organized into traditional groups that go back into late imperial China, of people taking turns borrowing money. Everybody pulls their money, and then they take turns borrowing from the common pool. And so various means that I outline in my book, Re-Enchanting Modernity. And so that's how it began, that they started small family enterprises, and then as people gained more private money, there was this spirit of generosity, because in order to have successful businesses, they have to beg the gods. So they have to demonstrate generosity. So that is what I would like to bring out, is the economic dimension of religion, is that they basically reverted back to age-old patterns of where religion and economics are intricately tied together, reinforcing each other. And that goes back 1,000 years to the Song dynasty of commercialization in China. So what I see is just once the pressure was off by the state forces of modernity, then they reverted back to really old patterns that go back at least 1,000 years of religion pushing economics and economics supporting and reinforcing religion, and religion serving as a redistributive mechanism that moderated the profit economy. And that continues to be the case today, I think, that religion has a very important redistributive function in the market economy. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Fisher, Professor Yang mentioned this public spiritedness that she saw in the community she studied, and really the emergence of a communal spirit after the Mao era, that after it had been repressed for many years. Tell us about your experience doing field work in China and what you saw in terms of how interest in religion grew and expanded.
Yes, certainly. So my research mostly focuses on the urban part in urban China, and I've been looking at, in particular, the revival of lay Buddhism over the last 20 years or so. And what I've seen, certainly a communal spirit, but one that I think is a little bit different than what we would find in rural areas. In urban areas, we have people who desire kind of voluntary communities that maybe aren't satisfied with the communities created by family or work. And Buddhism provides, as well as Protestant Christianity, provides a means for them to have those communities. However, the communities, I think, are in Buddhism are much looser than those in Protestant Christianity. Oftentimes, people don't have close associations with their fellow practitioners, or they do with a small group, but not a larger one. So a Buddhist practice is, to some degree in urban China, individualistic. It is about individual salvation. It's about people dislocated either by choice or not by choice from their own communities, wherever they came from, and desiring a new kind of community and a new opportunity for self-development within Buddhist temple environments.
But what are the specific social groups that you identified that were taking part in these lay Buddhist communities?
Predominantly, most lay Buddhists in China today are over the age of 50. For the majority of Buddhists in China today, as has been the case in centuries past, Buddhism is a religion that helps prepare you for the end of your life and the beginning of a next one. And while the majority of scholarship actually hasn't focused on this dimension, that is the dominant nature of lay Buddhism in temples today. But there are also younger Buddhists that have emerged, particularly within the last 10 to 15 years, that have been involved in charity work, which is a growing dimension of there's a growing dimension of Buddhist involvement in charity work in urban China, and also in things like mindfulness meditation movements. So actually meditation movements that translate Western books on adapting Buddhist meditation for secular Western life, translating them back into Chinese and marketing them to young professionals in China today. That is people largely between the ages of around 25 and maybe 50, 55. And for those people, Buddhism is increasingly appealing as a way to take a pause or a break from their kind of stressful professional and family lives and kind of reassess and reevaluate themselves. And sometimes they do that in very tight-knit practice communities where secrets can be shared in confidence. And so that kind of helps with their social development as well as connecting to a kind of more religiously ethical goal.
Professor Osburg, you also studied the growing interest in particularly Tibetan Buddhism. What did you see as the drivers of that in terms of the dynamics. Like Gareth just mentioned, preparing for the end of life and do charitable work and these kind of things. What did you see as the drivers?
So I think I would highlight maybe two drivers. The first actually is I can tell a story of how I got interested in this topic in the first place. So around the time that Xi Jinping kicked off the anti-corruption campaign around 2013, a friend of mine was telling me stories. He owns a car dealership, and he said these businessmen, in particular in real estate and mining, kept showing up with these Tibetan monks and purchasing luxury cars for them. And and this highlights one of the drivers of interest in Tibetan Buddhism, but also other forms of religious practice, is simply a kind of seeking a kind of cosmic protection, that might protect you from the anti-corruption campaign, but maybe will enhance your business success. And so there is, and this has always been an element of Chinese religious practice, a kind of pragmatic orientation. But what I've seen in my research is sometimes that evolves into, really sincere, transformative kinds of religious practice, where some of these entrepreneurs who, were giving money to a Tibetan monk because they thought it would be good for their business, end up involved in charity, end up involved in really intense kind of Buddhist cultivation and study a few years later. So beyond the pragmatic dimension, another aspect that I think is driving interest in religion, I would maybe label the therapeutic dimension. It was common in my research to find people who experienced a personal crisis, the illness or passing away of a loved one, divorce, a financial crisis, and they felt themselves really adrift. And often, on the recommendation of a friend, they saw a Buddhist monk, either Chinese or Tibetan, and that marked their entry point into their engagement with religion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I wonder, this is something I wonder about, is how much people are influenced by their peers and family members when it comes to matters of faith. And did you get a sense from your research of how that dynamic is working in the communities you studied in China?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely plays, well, it's, less familial networks, especially in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, because most of these, most people are coming from secular households. But yeah, it's often a friend, who recommends, who will, and because these are often unofficial, informal religious activities, you often need someone who knows where this monk is giving an empowerment or a teaching to be able to attend. But it's interesting, people do a bit of shopping around, though. And some of the people in my study who landed on Tibetan Buddhism talked about going to some some church services, Protestant services, and feeling like they didn't connect with them, and then ultimately ended up in Tibetan Buddhism. But I even had people who were sort of devout Buddhists for a while, but then they wanted to be more in touch with their Chinese cultural roots, and they kind of turned back to Confucianism and Taoism and so, but clearly, I think people's social networks, and what's popular within those networks plays a big role. And so that was, Tibetan Buddhism was clearly popular and still is among certain, elite segments of society. There's an element of fashion, there's several pop stars and movie stars who are, public about their interest in Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, Jet Li, the singer Wang Fei are probably the most famous ones. And so I think there's a bit of an elite cachet associated with it.
Well, people buying Land Cruisers for their tokus, these are people of means.
Right. But, I think, though, the typical, going back to your initial question, I mean, the typical Chinese practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism was more like middle class rather than, and I think perhaps it skews a bit younger, than some of the people in Gareth's study. They tend to be well educated, having traveled to Tibetan areas, that also sparks interest in Tibetan Buddhism sometimes.
Yeah. Hey, I'd like to just get in a little bit to what's been going on in the past few years. The pandemic in China was an extremely disruptive event. People read a lot into the white paper protests and how the government responded to them. And I think there's some evidence that suggests that during the pandemic, a lot of people began to explore different types of religious experience, and they also turn to therapy in greater numbers to deal with the psychological pressures of life during the pandemic in particular. So I'd just like to open it to anyone. Have you seen any evidence for a change in how views of religion have altered since the end of the pandemic?
I can start on this. I think one of the things that I've noticed, I haven't done any on the ground field work since the pandemic, but I have been in touch with some online groups, including some of the groups that I did in person field work on in the late 20 teens. So one of the things that was very striking about one of the meditation groups that I was following in the late 20 teens is when they had their in-person meetings in the temple, they would often be rather self-critical about their practice and say, okay, I'm learning all these techniques about how to calm the mind, about how to deal compassionately with people and not get angry, which was a major concern that they had. But when I go back into my secular life, it just all falls apart and I'm still, back to where I was before. But during the pandemic, when I attended a lot of online meditation sessions from the same group, they would say, I have a whole set of ethical and therapeutic resources that other people don't have right now. So all my family and friends are freaking out. We're in a pandemic, we're in a lockdown, but I'm going around volunteering and helping to deliver meals to people. And I'm scared about getting this virus, but I feel like Buddhism has prepared me to handle the stress and to handle the moment, right? So for some of their, at least as they described it, for some of their friends, there was this sense of going from, oh, what are you doing in this crazy temple once a week that we don't know about, to, oh, you have learned something, you have this kind of resource. How is it that you're so calm in this situation, right? And so that does make Buddhism more attractive to some people. But one thing I do think the pandemic has created a problem for Buddhists with, in addition to some of the recent political regulations, is that it makes a lot of unregistered groups a little bit more precarious because they don't have that institution to fall back on. And particularly Buddhist-themed tea houses, which is something I've looked at recently. Some of them could not remain commercially viable during the pandemic, right? So they had to shut down. So in some sense, it's strengthened institutionalized Buddhism, but it's also, I think, made Buddhism appear as a more attractive option to a greater range of people.
Can you tell us a bit about the Buddhist-themed tea houses and what those are?
Yeah, well, there's a great range. Again, this is a really interesting new area of research that myself and a couple of other scholars are looking at. That they're really since sort of probably the early 2000s, but more so beginning from about the early 20 teens. A lot of entrepreneurs took advantage of the state's opening of a category of Buddhist culture, which is, so there's Buddhist, the state now recognizes Buddhist culture and Buddhist religion. And Buddhist religion has to stay in approved temple sites, but Buddhist culture can move into public space. Now, the question is, of course, what counts as Buddhist culture? And this is always a shifting category, and people are always looking for the state to provide some sort of direction on this, which they don't always do. But some more entrepreneurial Buddhists said, well, we'll set up our tea house and we'll have Buddhist statues and Buddhist paintings in the tea house. And then some of these tea houses, that's it. It's just about Buddhist art and architecture, and then everything else is secular within the tea house space. But other ones are saying, well, as soon as there's a couple of tea tables in the front of our tea house, but as soon as you go into the back, there's a meditation space, there's a sutra chanting space, and it really almost is like a temple disguised as a tea house, right? So there's a huge range, and there's a lot of middle range within that. So it is anything from people finding another space to meet other people voluntarily and talk about things you normally can't in regular life, right? Or all the way to kind of a full out Buddhist practice, like a temple type space.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of sounds like the coffee houses back in the 60s, where people would sit around and talk about peace, love, and revolution, things like that.
Yes.
You're not old enough.
Very
You're not old enough to
apolitical.
remember that.
Well,
Politics is frowned upon, definitely. And when people try to bring up political questions, everyone would just go silent.
Well, I think in my book, I emphasize how uh, local religions in the rural and small town areas really are a form of traditional civil society. So I use that word. It's religious civil society that offers a space. People do get together for rituals and festivals and banquets, communal banquets, and when they meet, they do talk about politics and the outrage of local officials sometimes, taking up land, 征地, confiscating land and buying it at super low prices in order to build up new shopping malls and things like that. So, yeah, it does offer that space. And we also need to think about this kind of gradations of secularism and religiosity. It's not cut and dried, it's not clear cut. There's a lot of middle ground between, like you said, like Gareth was saying about Buddhist culture. And that's a very murky in between. And I think people thrive in that in between. China is still overall a highly secularized society, but the in between gray zones are increasing. And I think it produces a more diversified population. Some people are very transcendent oriented. They really transcend temporal space. And others are very much mired in, the market economy and the cutthroat, big fish eat little fish. But there's plenty of spaces in between, and religion really helps expand that space.
Yeah. John, you've written about people who grew up in secular households where even so communist party officials, children, and they have discovered religion later in life, and it was a religion that they were not raised in. So you've written about that. What's behind that, do you think?
Well, going back to my answer to your earliest question, there's often, especially in those sorts of households, there isn't a pre-existing framework for dealing with, crises in one's life. They don't have a religious tradition to fall back on. And, official ideology doesn't do a very good job of,
Yeah.
handling, one's personal existential questions. And so there's, at least in my interviews with, Buddhist practitioners, and they often highlight this sense that the kind of the ideas that their family provided them, just weren't satisfactory. They didn't really give them a sense of meaning or purpose in life. And certainly when in moments of crisis, they felt like they needed something more. And sometimes this produces conflicts within families. I encountered a few instances in my research of some, usually an adult, but who becomes a devout Buddhist, and one of their parents passes away, and they want to give their Marxist party member father a Buddhist funeral, and this sometimes creates some tensions within the family. I should note also that this is especially Tibetan Buddhism, but I think Gareth can weigh in on this, and Mayfair. This is a very gendered phenomenon, and so most of the teachings and rituals that I have attended, it's usually about 70% women, and sometimes it was a real common pattern where the husband would sort of tolerate Buddhism but was not a practitioner, would sometimes donate money towards various sorts of rituals and that kind of thing, but then his wife was a devout Buddhist, and sometimes conflicts arose over to what extent to teach to bring their children into the sort of Buddhist, world, or to have them attend these teachings and not. And that was another source of conflict within these kind of secular households.
Professor Fisher, you've also studied this, people from secular households developing an interest in some religious tradition.
Yes, I mean, most households are secular in urban China, so to begin with, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So partly it's that. I mean, if people are going to come out of somewhere, they're going to come out of a secular household. But it's interesting because in traditional Chinese religion, the traditional Chinese religion is very family centered. But then you have these urban environments in post-Mao China where religiosity, as I said a little earlier, has become more individually centered. So you have people that are in households where they're the only practicing Buddhists, and other people can't understand why they're practicing Buddhism. And I've even met people whose family don't even know that they're practicing Buddhism, right? That are sort of sneaking off to the temple and the family doesn't know. More often the family does know, but they may not know the extent to which they're committed to Buddhism. And families sometimes grudgingly tolerate, they're sometimes intrigued, but not fully wanting to enter, or they're sometimes downright in opposition to the practice. And this also works between the generations. I've met people whose children feel, oh no, now my mother, my father, my grandparents are going to the temple all the time. They're interested in superstition. I've met the reverse. I've met people who find that they have teenage children that suddenly out of nowhere developed a passionate interest in Buddhism, have converted as lay Buddhists, and they're really worried that that's going to interfere with their studies at high school or university. And there's a whole kind of tug of war that goes on. So this is a common situation. And I do concur with John's findings. I also found that about 70% of the committed practitioners that I interviewed are women.
Yeah, Professor Yang, I know you've written about, and you just mentioned earlier, about the entrepreneurs who use their wealth to build temples or churches or to, in some way, support the religious communities they're part of, or to perhaps demonstrate their status. What do you see as the impact on the communities where these people are doing these kind of things?
The sort of the economic activity as impact on religion. So yeah, I often want to push back against putting the economy first. Because I also see religion as leading the economy. So it's a kind of a mutual relationship. And where, of course, if you're wealthy, you are expected to give more to your lineage, ancestor hall, to all the expenses of ancestor rituals that gathers the community together. And also to the Buddhist or Taoist temple or to a deity temple festival. At the same time, in order to get rich, you also need the help of the gods, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So to get rich, you need to start up religion. So in many ways, religion can be leading the economy because people believe in the gods, or they have an illness and some god helps them, and that pushes them forward to express generosity and gratitude to the gods, and they will give. So there's this religion I saw in Wenzhou. At the same time that everyone is very money-minded and pushing around each other in competition to gain more profit, they turn around and they also give. So it's so I see the two forces: the market economy, the profit economy, on the one hand, has its own logic of accumulation and competition and greed. On the other hand, there's another force working alongside it, but semi-independent, and that's the religious logic. The religious logic I have called a ritual economy, where the thrust of that logic is that you have to be generous. You have to be giving out to the community, to the gods, to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And these temples that receive your donations and wealth turn around and they redistribute to the poor, to widows, orphans, to helping young people get into pay for their school tuition at every level, all the way up to college and beyond. These organizations, religious organizations, I call them, like lineages that worship their ancestors, as well as Taoist, Buddhist, and deity temples. They serve this function of bringing people together with the wealth that they receive. So it's intertwined. So I would say that the ritual economy has a semi-separate logic of giving out that counters the profit economy, which is all about taking in, raking in all that wealth. So it serves as a moderating mechanism that prevents, in many ways, what we have here now in the United States, where we're giving away giving away all this public land, public wealth to the billionaires who don't pay taxes.
Yeah. Just a reminder for those of you watching live, we will save some time at the end to take your questions. You can submit those using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Professor Osburg, I know you've also written about wealthy entrepreneurs who have built churches in their communities. I was just wondering, what has been the impact on the communities where this is a common phenomenon?
Oh, I haven't really looked at church building at all in any kind of detail. Probably Mayfair would be better to comment on that. I mean, I've looked at wealthy entrepreneurs who've given substantial donations to temple building projects and stupa building projects, but they've primarily actually been not in their community, but in Tibetan areas, this was actually an interesting finding, that a lot of the philanthropy that some of these wealthy practitioners of Tibetan Buddhists were involved in were actually completely oriented towards Tibetan communities, rather than, despite them being Han Chinese themselves. They kind of, partly their charitable activities were guided by their Tibetan teachers, but also they had a kind of cynicism about mainstream Chinese society and engaging in philanthropy there, and seeing it as a less spiritually productive, an endeavor that's less likely to generate a kind of karmic return.
Thank you. I know, Professor Fisher, you've looked at temple building.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what, I mean, I'm wondering, how does this not just, we talked a lot about the individual and the individual's relationship to their practice and how it benefits them as an individual. So I'd just like to get at it, but do you see the impact on the communities or on a broader society of these temple building or other kinds of public shows of devotion or faith?
It's interesting, and it's complicated. I think potentially a lot of my research on temple building, particularly early on, was focused on how people from urban areas attempted to reconstruct rural Buddhist temples. And that does eject money, it ejects culture, it ejects religion into the local economy. But very often the attitude of the urban lay Buddhists was not so much, we want to build up a community in rural areas. It was sort of, well, we should just build a Buddhist temple somewhere in China, so that this will be a meritorious action. Right. And it's something that spreads the Dharma, and it doesn't matter who you spread the Dharma to. So it's not about investing in some village or towns in some part of the country. It's about whoever will let you build a temple there, and then you'll go to that place and build it. So very often there isn't a strong relationship between these lay patrons and from urban areas and the rural communities that they're helping. But sometimes in those communities, yes, the temple can be a site of kind of community development and local economic development, but not always. Sometimes the temple seems like it's built by faraway people, and it has a purpose that's kind of related to people from the outside, and they're the ones who end up using it, and it kind of doesn't end up being integrated that effectively into the local community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm thinking also here of things that the government has done to sort of alter the religious landscape in China. For example, by ordering the Sinicization of mosque architecture, or by having crosses removed from the tops of churches. So I'm just wondering if any of you would like to comment, have a view on this. It seems that for many believers, the act of building a temple or putting up these things is purely spiritual in intent, whereas the government tends to interpret it as political, or at least reads it in a political context. So, any of you care to comment?
I think this is where we get back to the question of secularization, right? Because for a religious practitioner, especially someone who's come from, as you discussed earlier, a secular household and has converted themselves to Christianity or to Buddhism, they believe that Chinese society should become more Buddhist or should become more Christian. So they don't really respect the idea necessarily of having to just stay within that religious boundary. But the state does not want, it allows a certain room for religion in public space, as we talked about with Buddhist culture, but it wants to control that. And it doesn't want other people controlling that, right? So when you put up unauthorized crosses, or you put up temples or other things that the state doesn't really approve of, under sinicization, which is really a kind of code word for greater government control, because the government interprets what sinicization means, what Chineseness is, right? Then they're going to want to increasingly control and regulate that. And also regulations for things like temple building have become much more complex. There's far fewer new temples being constructed in the 2010s and the 2020s than there were in the previous 2 decades. And I've been with monks that have gone kind of had plans that were all laid out and all agreed at the local level, but then got scuttled by new regulations, and so they just couldn't go forward. I think with Islam and with mosques, it's a little bit different, because there's a much wider fear with the state of the presence of Islam more generally. And so there we see less of a concern about religion, Islam in public space, but Islam altogether it is more of a danger. So I think some of the desire to change mosque architecture is motivated from that.
Yeah, Professor Yang, how do you see the Beijing's tightening control of religious expression in China? What do you think is really behind that?
I think it certainly has a lot to do with the top leadership. Maybe the way President Xi was raised. So I think a lot of it is kind of that kind of Soviet background that has taken over since 2013, because before that, things were a bit more open and flexible. But since then, there has been this tightening. But I think that there's constant tension and pushback, and people down at the grassroots are they're biding their time. They are persistent and patient, and also stubborn. So at the same time, so it's a constant. It's not an unceasing tension, struggle, pushback. At the same time, what we also see, and what I wrote in my book, is the creeping Buddhification of the state at the local level. So Buddhism is the strongest of all the different religious cultures, and I see a lot of officials who are Buddhists under the table, and they support Buddhist efforts in a kind of invisible way. Sometimes they even lead Buddhist efforts, at rebuilding temples. And the public certainly supports that. And they will gain a lot of popular support as an official. Maybe these officials are acting on personal interests of building up merit, but at the same time, it's also both temporal as well as spiritual merit because the public supports that. So, but they cannot speak out about it publicly. It's a kind of, so I see more of that in at the in within the state, that the state itself becomes religiously oriented. It's the foreign religions that are more of a threat, because Christianity, which in at its very core was in many ways, depending on how you read the core tenets of Christianity, of Protestant, new Christianity, Jesus was in some ways a rebel against the Roman Empire. And also Islam was a militant kind of proselytizing religion. So these are, it needs to be domesticated. These two foreign religions needs to be domesticated. And I think that Taoism and Buddhism, even though they have had religious peasant rebellion outbursts in the past in China's long history, at the same time, they have long periods of domestication and cooperation with the state, with the imperial state. So the state feels safer with those religions. They fall in line more easily. That's what I have to say right now, for now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Professor Osburg, you've also written about how people, and you mentioned this a little while ago, people who are turning to religion, one consideration when they choose what flavor of religion they're going to try is that they want to avoid things they see as tainted by the inter-party state interference, and somehow makes them less authentic or less appealing. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a real, especially among some of the kind of well-educated middle-class Buddhists that I've encountered in my research, a real search for authenticity. Initially they're clueless and trying to figure things out, but as their engagement with Buddhism deepens, and this is especially true in Tibetan Buddhism, where they want to find, part of the appeal is that they perceive Tibetan Buddhism as having more undiluted, authentic teachings compared with Chinese Buddhism. And in the case of and also in Tibetan Buddhism, as your audience is probably aware, you have the Communist Party now kind of actively intervening in the process of reincarnation of prominent Tibetan lamas. And this is something that many Chinese only had a vague awareness of, but some of the Chinese Buddhists involved with Tibetan Buddhism now are very sensitive to this, and they're very interested in trying to figure out, who are the lamas that the Tibetans recognize rather than the ones that are being promoted by the party state, because there's a perception that the ones promoted by the party state are going to be offering a kind of diluted, tainted, dharma, not the authentic teachings that they're interested in. So I think it's a good illustration of how the kind of this attempt to kind of co-opt the spiritual charisma of religious figures and religious institutions under Xi could really backfire, right? It could kind of undermine their credibility, and just push people again to these kind of unofficial gray spaces of religious activity and practice.
Yeah, Professor Fisher, what is your view? How much are people concerned about these issues of authenticity and sincerity, and the making sure that their teacher or their guru is the real deal?
I also find this a great deal. In my, especially the research I did for my first book in the early 2000s, it focuses on, it's at an authorized temple in Beijing, but it focuses on the kind of outer courtyard of that temple where there are all of these kind of unauthorized lay preachers that come and just speak and have no qualifications, except they sort of capture the public mood in a way that the temple monastics don't. And then among those people, there was a great deal of concern with finding the authentic teacher. And in some cases, and those preachers would do a really good job to try to make the monks appear inauthentic, right? And they would use the same sort of arguments that John is talking about, that they're just puppets of the state, that they're not relating Buddhist teachings to real life issues of today, and I am, right? And so they would get followers in that way. In my more recent research in the 2010s has been more at authorized temple sites led by those temple leaders. And so in that case, authenticity kind of has not been raised as much, but there is a perception among some of those people that a lot of the Han Chinese Buddhist monks that were criticized by the lay preachers I studied or criticized by the Tibetan Buddhist followers that John is studying, that they are authentic, right? And they're not simply puppets of the state, and that they have their own agendas. So it kind of depends on who you talk to. But I do think that there is a general concern with authenticity and sincerity because there is a fear that everyday secular life is somehow fake, that people do not present a sincere face. They can't be trusted. So whichever Buddhist you believe, right, you still want to somehow search for the authentic. And find someone who you believe is sincerely interested in you and not simply in making money or towing the party line, right? So this is a persistent concern, and it's a persistent concern among non-Buddhist or non-religious believers as well, I think.
Professor Young, have you seen this? What Gareth was just talking about, how in a way some of what's behind this is a lack of trust in society.
Yeah, I've heard Buddhists in Wenzhou complaining about the fake Buddhist monks who are basically not real monks. There are college students who get dressed up as monks and who have wives and eat meat at home, and they are sent out into the famous temples across the country because they can speak English and they can talk to the tourists. So there's some of that concern going on. Yeah.
And another thing you mentioned just earlier is the differential treatment that the different religions are getting in China from the government, right? So on the one side, you have the religions that are seen as maybe indigenous or largely indigenous, like Taoism and the Chinese Buddhism, and on the other, Islam, Christianity. Have you seen any change in how these different communities are treated in the last few years, say?
Christians and Muslims.
Yeah.
I think the concern is increasing for Muslims. I think maybe Christians are, they've had their battles, and, in Wenzhou, the Christians were getting too bold. They were starting to, I think this was about 9 years ago, the Christians started to be more declaratory about their pride, religious pride, and they put up gigantic electrified red crosses, huge, on their churches.
Mm-hmm.
And this offended party types, and there was an order to take them down. And there was a gigantic church, I think it was called Sanjiang Protestant Church. It was a huge cathedral, Protestant cathedral, that was totally demolished. And that was a huge amount of money that was sunk into that church, and it was completely demolished. And so, there's a lot of seething anger, of course, at the grassroots, but they keep it quiet. But this they're very persistent. I think they bide their time. They check the political winds, and as soon as there's an opportunity, it will pop up again. But I wanted to also raise this issue about religion, especially like Buddhism, which came out from outside China, Christianity and Islam, is through religiosity, you also have a new kind of globalization of Chinese culture. So I've started a new field site in Lumbini, Nepal, which is the birthplace of Gautama Buddha. And I notice a lot of Chinese pilgrims / tourists in Lumbini. And so you have a lot of Chinese religious followers of whatever foreign religion like Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Islam and Christianity, who are going to the originating holy lands of these places in outside China. And in the case of Nepal and India, Chinese Buddhists are very large in numbers. So they are, putting money into India and Nepal, and they're even building infrastructure to facilitate more tourism. So this is also Chinese money that's coming in to Nepal and India, building better infrastructure to withstand more tourism from China.
And these are places like Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Nalanda,
Yes.
all of these historic sites.
Yes. Yeah, they're building better roads and so on. And in Nepal, they had a big earthquake in 2015, and the Chinese government put in a lot of money in rebuilding the central heart of Kathmandu, which are the ancient Nepalese temples and palaces.
Great. I want to go into a few questions. We got a number of questions from the audience, some very good questions. Thank you very much for submitting these. I'll start with this one from Anonymous. Regarding the future of religion in China, do you see these gray areas, the gray areas that we mentioned earlier, expanding long-term, or will the leadership crack down even harder? Anybody volunteer?
That's really a hard question I mean, it's very hard to predict future developments in China, right? I could see it going either way, right? I could see where certainly the state wants to micromanage religion, and even sort of small online groups are worried about attracting state attention. But on the other hand, there is this category of Buddhist culture that moves religion more into this, Buddhism at least, more into this gray area, and that can develop. And I think we'll see periodic crackdowns, but I think in the long term, it's very, very hard to kind of control the gray area, and sometimes the state wants to encourage it, or sometimes local states want to encourage it. So the state itself is, I think, quite ambivalent to gray area religiosity. It wants to maintain a secularized society, but it wants to encourage Buddhism when it can contribute to pride in China, or some kind of a social outlet for social tensions. But it doesn't want to it always wants to control things, but it can't control everything, right? So again, there's a kind of paradox there.
Well, I think that's a key point, right? Is that a lot of this is tolerated, and is tolerated for a reason. And as you mentioned, part of it is pride in traditional Chinese culture. Part of it is that it provides a kind of public good, and it helps people deal with the stress and the problems they have in their lives. But I think one thing where the crackdown has already been really tight has been with the relationships between religious communities in China and those abroad. People communicating with their co-religionists overseas makes the Chinese government very nervous. Just very recently, we saw some new guidelines come out that further restricted the ability of foreign clergy and religious figures to carry out or religious duties or to lead worship or these kind of things within China. So you could see where their control is already very, very tight in the areas where the Chinese government is most concerned. But there's still a big gray area where the government is I think more than happy to allow people a certain degree of the right kind of freedom. Anyone like to add to that?
Well, I think historians of modern Chinese Buddhism, from the Republican to later, have pointed out that, in early 20th century China, and down to the present, excluding the Maoist radical years, that Buddhism, maybe even during the Maoist era, but Buddhism served as an important kind of diplomatic bridge with foreign countries in Asia, right? So Buddhism, had that valuable role of linking up diplomatically, enhancing diplomatic relations with Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, all the countries of Southeast Asia. And so there is a soft spot for Buddhism. And, also with Nepal and India now, too. So there is a soft spot, and that role will always be there, I think. That will allow the state to be more flexible with Buddhism. And, Buddhism is also tends to be more peace-loving, and that puts the state more at ease. Finally, the state is serious about environmental concerns. And so that's the thing that we haven't talked about is the role of the different religions play in environmental protection. And China has deployed Buddhism and Taoism especially towards environmental protection, because religion serves as a very important motivation for the planting of trees in desertification. I just had a conference here at UC Santa Barbara on Society for the Anthropology of Religion biennial conference, where there were a couple of papers on Buddhism in northwestern provinces of Xinjiang and Gansu, which are experiencing desertification, where Buddhism was an important propellant for the mass planting of trees against desertification. And Buddhism's promotion of vegetarianism is also, and also Taoism is also very good for the environment, as it, Chinese have become heavy meat eaters now, the secular part of China, and they are importing loads of beef from Latin America and North America. And so that kind of contributes to the, moving slightly away from the heavy-duty eating of meat, which is not good for the environment and not good for global poverty.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Yang is currently the president of the Society for the Anthropology of Religion, and she and I have discussed putting together a webinar like this later this year to talk about religion and the environment in China. I hope you remember that, Professor Yang. We're still going to do that.
Right, yes.
Okay. Just let's take one more question, also anonymous. Does the government discourage the circulation of scriptures or the written words, such as the Bible? Just very short, does the government discourage this kind of censorship of religious texts?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
John?
Yeah, I mean, one real big recent change is, and Gareth alluded to this already, is, you used to have these very, very active WeChat groups, organized around Buddhism, and they've become, they still exist, but to the extent the content is almost devoid of any explicit reference to religion, and sometimes they have to use coded language to refer to, Buddhist concepts. But, yeah,
Right, and the
Very good.
Christians too. Yeah.
And the Christians too. Yeah. Well,
Christians as
thank you.
well.
Thank you to everyone who submitted these questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to take any more of these questions. Thank you to the three of you for joining this discussion today. I certainly enjoyed it a great deal. And we hope to see you again back here at the Asia Society for another webinar soon. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.